Section 14 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. A Last Attempt. When fortune means to men most good, she looks upon them with a threatening eye. King John. The sleep of Horace Byrd that night was anything but refreshing. In the first place, he was troubled about this fellow Brown, whose last impertinence showed he was a man to be watched, and, if possible, understood. Secondly, he was haunted by a vision of the unhappy youth he had just left, seeing again and again, both in his dreams and in the rush of heated fancies which followed his awakening, that picture of utter despair which the opening of his neighbor's door had revealed. He could not think of that poor mortal as sleeping. Whether it was the result of his own sympathetic admiration for Miss Dare, or of some subtle clairvoyance bestowed upon him by the darkness and stillness of the hour, he felt assured that the quiet watch he had interrupted by his careless importunity had been again established, and that if he could tear down the partition separating their two rooms, he should see the bowed form and buried face crouched despairingly above the disfigured picture. The depths of human misery and the maddening passions that underlie all crime has been revealed to him, for the first time, perhaps, in all their terrible suggestiveness, and he asked himself over and over, as he tossed on his uneasy pillow, if he possessed the needful determination to carry on the scheme he had undertaken, in the face of the unreasoning sympathies which the phantomless misery of this young man had aroused. Under the softening influence of the night he answered, no. But when the sunlight came, and the full flush of life, with its restless duties and common necessities, awoke within him, he decided, yes. Mr. Mansell was not at the breakfast table when Mr. Byrd came down. His duties at the mill were peremptory, and he had already taken his coffee and gone. But Mr. Brown was there, and at the sight of him Mr. Byrd's caution took alarm, and he bestowed upon this intrusive busybody a close and searching scrutiny. It, however, elicited nothing in the way of his own enlightenment beyond the fact that this fellow, total stranger though he seemed, was for some inexplicable reason an enemy to himself or his plans. Not that Mr. Brown manifested this by any offensive token of dislike or even of mistrust. On the contrary, he was excessively polite, and let slip no opportunity for dragging Mr. Byrd into the conversation. Yet, for all that, a secret influence was already at work against the detective, and he could not attribute it to any other source than the jealous efforts of this man. Miss Hart was actually curt to him, and in the attitude of the various persons about the board he detected a certain reserve which had been entirely absent from their manner the evening before. But while placing, as he thought, due weight upon this fellow's animosity, he had no idea to what it would lead, till he went upstairs. Mrs. Hart, who had hitherto treated him with the utmost cordiality, now called him into the parlor, and told him frankly that she would be obliged to him if he would let her have his room. To be sure, she qualified the seeming harshness of her request by an intimation that a permanent occupant had applied for it, and offered to pay his board at the hotel till he could find a room to suit him in another house. But the fact remained that she was really in a flutter to rid herself of him, and no subterfuge could hide it, and Mr. Byrd, to whose plans the full confidence of those around him was essential, found himself obliged to acquiesce in her desires, and announced at once his willingness to depart. Instantly she was all smiles, and overwhelmed him with overtures of assistance, but he courteously declined her help, and flying from her apologies with what speed he could, went immediately to his room. Here he sat down to deliberate. The facts he had gleaned, despite the interference of his unknown enemy, were three. First, that Craik Mansell had found excuses for not attending the inquest or even the funeral of his murdered aunt. Secondly, that he had a strong passion for invention, and had even now the model of a machine on hand. And third, that he was not at home, wherever else he may have been, on the morning of the murder in Sibley. A poor and meagre collection of insignificant facts, thought Mr. Byrd, too poor and meagre to avail much in stemming the tide threatening to overwhelm Gouverneur Hildreth. But what opportunity remained for making them weightier? He was turned from the house that held the few persons from whom he could hope to glean more complete and satisfactory information, and he did not know where else to seek it unless he went to the mill. And this was an alternative from which he shrank, as it would, in the first place, necessitate a revelation of his real character, and secondly, make known the fact that Mr. Mansell was under the surveillance of the police, if not in the actual attitude of a suspected man. A quick and hearty, "Sure you are very good, sir," uttered in the hall without, roused him from his meditations and turned his thoughts in a new direction. What if he could learn something from the servants? He had not thought of them. This girl, now, whose work constantly carried her into the various rooms on this floor, would of course know whether Mr. Mansell had been away on the day of the murder, even if she could not tell the precise time of his return. At all events, it was worth while to test her with a question or two before he left, even if he had to resort to the means of spurring her memory with money. His failure in other directions did not necessitate a failure here. He accordingly called her in, and showing her a bright silver dollar, asked her if she thought it good enough pay for a short answer to a simple question. To his great surprise, she blushed and drew back, shaking her head and muttering that her mistress didn't like to have the girls talk to the young men about the house, and finally going off with a determined toss of her frowsy head that struck Mr. Byrd aghast, and made him believe more than ever that his evil star hung in the ascendant, and that the sooner he quit the house the better. In 10 minutes he was in the street. But one thing now remained for him to do. He must make the acquaintance of one of the mill owners, or possibly an overseer or an accountant, and from him learn where Mr. Mansell had been at the time of his aunt's murder. To this duty he devoted the day, but here also he was met by unexpected difficulties. Though he took pains to disguise himself before proceeding to the mill, all the endeavors which he made to obtain an interview there with any responsible person were utterly fruitless. Whether his ill luck at the house had followed him to this place he could not tell, but for some reason or other there was not one of the gentlemen for whom he inquired but had some excuse for not seeing him, and worn out at last with repeated disappointments, if not oppressed by the doubtful looks he received from the various subordinates who carried his messages, he left the building and proceeded to make use of the only means now left to him of compassing his end. This was to visit Mr. Goodman, the one member of the firm who was not at his post that day, and see if from him he could gather the single fact he was in search of. Perhaps the atmosphere of distrust with which I am surrounded in this quarter has not reached this gentleman's house, thought he, and having learned from the directory where the house was, he proceeded immediately to it. His reception was by no means cordial. Mr. Goodman had been ill the night before, and was in no mood to see strangers. "Mansell?" he coolly repeated, in acknowledgment of the other's inquiry as to whether he had a person of that name in his employ. "Yes, our bookkeeper's name is Mansell. May I ask," and here Mr. Byrd felt himself subjected to a thorough, if not severe, scrutiny, why you come to me with inquiries concerning him." "Because," the determined detective responded, adopting at once the bold course, "you can put me in possession of a fact which it eminently benefits the cause of justice to know. I am an emissary, sir, from the District Attorney at Sibley, and the point I want settled is where Mr. Mansell was on the morning of the 26th of September." This was business, and the look that involuntarily leaped into Mr. Goodman's eye proved that he considered it so. He did not otherwise betray his feelings, however, but turning quietly toward a chair into which he slowly settled himself before replying, "And why do you not ask the gentleman himself where he was? He probably would be quite ready to tell you." The inflection he gave to these words warned Mr. Byrd to be careful. The truth was, Mr. Goodman was Mr. Mansell's best friend, and as such had his own reasons for not being especially communicative in his regard to this stranger. The detective vaguely felt this, and immediately changed his manner. "I have no doubt of that, sir," he ingenuously answered. "But Mr. Mansell has had so much to distress him lately that I was desirous of saving him from the unpleasantness which such a question would necessarily cause. It is only a small matter, sir. A person, it is not essential to state whom, has presumed to raise the question among the authorities in Sibley as to whether Mr. Mansell, as heir of the poor Mrs. Clemmens' small property, might not have had some hand in her dreadful death. There was no proof to sustain the assumption, and Mr. Mansell was not even known to have been in the town on or after the day of her murder, but justice, having listened to the aspersion, felt bound to satisfy itself of its falsity, and I was sent here to learn where Mr. Mansell was upon that fatal day. I find he was not in Buffalo, but this does not mean he was in Sibley. I am sure that, if you will, you can supply me with facts that will lead to a complete and satisfactory alibi for him." But the hard caution of the other was not to be moved. "I am sorry," said he, "but I can give you no information in regard to Mr. Mansell's travels. You will have to ask the gentleman himself." "You did not send him out on business of your own, then?" "No." "But you knew he was going?" "Yes." "And can you tell me when he came back?" "He was in his place on Wednesday." The cold, dry nature of these replies convinced Mr. Byrd that something more than the sullen obstinacy of an uncommunicative man lay behind this determined reticence. Looking at Mr. Goodman inquiringly, he calmly remarked, "You are a friend of Mr. Mansell?" The answer came quickly and coldly. "He is a constant visitor at my house." Mr. Byrd made a respectful bow. "You can, then, have no doubts of his ability to prove an alibi?" "I have no doubts concerning Mr. Mansell," was the stern and uncompromising reply. Mr. Byrd at once felt he had received his dismissal, but before making up his mind to go, he resolved upon one further effort. Calling to his aid his full power of acting, he slowly shook his head with a thoughtful air, and presently murmured half aloud and half, as it were, to himself, "I thought possibly he might have gone to Washington." Then, with a casual glance at Mr. Goodman, added, "He is an inventor, I believe?" "Yes," was again the laconic response. "Has he not a machine at present which he desires to bring to the notice of some capitalist?" "I believe he has," was the forced and none too amiable answer. Mr. Byrd at once leaned confidingly forward. "Don't you think," he asked, "that he may have gone to New York to consult with some one about this pet hobby of his? It would certainly be a natural thing for him to do, and if only I knew it was so, I could go back to Sibley with an easy conscience." His disinterested air and the tone of kindly concern which he had adopted seemed at last to produce its effect on his companion. Relaxing a trifle of his austerity, Mr. Goodman went so far as to admit that Mr. Mansell had told him that business connected with his patent had called him out of town, but beyond this he would allow nothing, and Mr. Byrd, baffled in his attempts to elicit from this man any distinct acknowledgment of Mr. Mansell's whereabouts at the critical time of Mrs. Clemmens' death, made a final bow and turned toward the door. It was only at this moment he discovered that Mr. Goodman and himself had not been alone in the room, that curled up in one of the window seats was a little girl of some 10 or 12 years of age, who at the first tokens of his taking his departure slipped shyly down to the floor and ran before him out into the hall. He found her by the front door when he arrived there. She was standing with her hand on the knob, and presented such a picture of childish eagerness, tempered by childish timidity, that he involuntarily paused before her with a smile. She needed no further encouragement. "Oh, sir, I know about Mr. Mansell," she cried. "He wasn't in that place you talk about, for he wrote a letter to papa just the day before he came back, and the postmark on the envelope was Monteith. I remember, because it was the name of the man who made our big map." And looking up with the eager zeal which marks the liking of very little folks for some one favorite person among their grown acquaintances, she added earnestly, "I do hope you won't let them say anything bad about Mr. Mansell. He is so good." And without waiting for a reply, she ran off, her curls dancing, her eyes sparkling, all her innocent little form alive with the joy of having done a kindness, as she thought, for her favorite, Mr. Mansell. Mr. Byrd, on the contrary, felt a strange pang that the information he had sought for so long and vainly should come at last from the lips of an innocent child. Monteith, as you remember, was the next station to Sibley. End of chapter 14. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The End of a Tortuous Path. Thus bad begins, and worse remains behind. Hamlet. The arrest of Mr. Hildreth had naturally quieted public suspicion by fixing attention upon a definite point, so that when Mr. Byrd returned to Sibley, he found that he could pursue whatever inquiries he chose without awakening the least mistrust that he was on the lookout for the murderer of Mrs. Clemmens. The first use he made of his time was to find out if Mr. Mansell, or any man answering to his description, had been seen to take the train from the Sibley station on the afternoon or evening of the fatal Tuesday. The result was unequivocal. No such person had been seen there, and no such person was believed to have been at the station at any time during that day. This was his first disappointment. He next made the acquaintance of the conductors on that line of street cars by means of which he believed Mr. Mansell to have made his escape, but with no better result. Not one of them remembered having taken up of late any passenger from the terminus of the appearance described by Mr. Byrd. And this was his second disappointment. His next duty was obviously to change his plan of action and make the town of Monteith the center of his inquiries. But he hesitated to do this till he had made one other visit to the woods, in whose recesses he still believed the murderer to have plunged immediately upon dealing the fatal blow. He went by the way of the street railroad, not wishing to be again seen crossing the bog, and arrived at the hut in the center of the glade without meeting any one or experiencing the least adventure. This time he went in, but nothing was to be seen save bare logs, a rough hearth where a fire had once been built, and the rudest sort of bench and table. And hurrying forth again, he looked doubtfully up and down the glade in pursuit of some hint to guide him in his future researches. Suddenly he received one. The thick wall of foliage, which at first glance revealed but the two outlets already traversed by him, showed upon close inspection a third path, opening well behind the hut, and leading, as he soon discovered, in an entirely opposite direction from that which had taken him to the west side. Merely stopping to cast one glance at the sun, which was still well overhead, he set out on this new path. It was longer and much more intricate than the other. It led through hollows and up steeps, and finally out into an open blackberry patch where it seemed to terminate. But a close study of the surrounding bushes soon disclosed signs of a narrow and thread-like passage curving about a rocky steep. Entering this, he presently found himself drawn again into the woods, which he continued to traverse till he came to a road cut through the heart of the forest, for the use of the lumbermen. Here he paused. Should he turn to the right or left? He decided to turn to the right. Keeping in the road, which was rough with stones, where it was not marked with the hoofs of both horses and cattle, he walked for some distance. Then he emerged into open space again, and discovered that he was on the hillside overlooking Monteith, and that by a mile or two's further walk over the highway that was dimly to be described at the foot of the hill, he would reach the small station devoted to the uses of the quarrymen that worked in this place. There was no longer any further doubt that this route, and not the other, had been the one taken by Mr. Mansell on that fatal afternoon. But he was determined not to trust any further to mere surmises. So hastening down the hill, he made his way in the direction of the highway, meaning to take the walk alluded to, and to learn for himself what passengers had taken the train at this point on the Tuesday afternoon so often mentioned. But a barrier rose in his way. A stream which he had barely noticed in the quick glance he threw over the landscape from the brow of the hill, separated with quite a formidable width of water the hillside from the road, and it was not till he wandered back for some distance along its banks that he found a bridge. The time thus lost was considerable, but he did not think of it, and when, after a long and weary tramp, he stepped upon the platform of the small station, he was so eager to learn if he had correctly followed the scent that he forgot to remark that the road he had taken was anything but an easy or feasible one for a hasty escape. The accommodation trains, which alone stop at this point, had both passed, and he found the station master at leisure. A single glance into his honest and intelligent face convinced the detective that he had a reliable man to deal with. He at once commenced his questions. "Do many persons beside the quarrymen take the train at this place?" asked he. "Not many," was the short but sufficiently good-natured rejoinder. "I guess I could easily count them on the fingers of one hand," he laughed. "You would be apt to notice, then, if a strange gentleman got on board here at any time, would you not?" "Guess so. Not often troubled that way, but sometimes. Can you tell me whether a young man of very dark complexion, heavy mustache, and a determined, if not excited expression, took the cars here for Monteith, say any day last week?" "I don't know," mused the man. "Dark complexion, you say, large mustache. Let me see." "No dandy," Mr. Byrd carefully explained, "but a strong man who believes in work. He was possibly in a state of somewhat nervous hurry," he went on suggestively, "and if he wore an overcoat at all, it was a gray one." The face of the man lighted up. "I seem to remember," said he. "Did he have a very bright blue eye and a high color?" Mr. Byrd nodded. "And did he carry a peculiarly shaped bag, of which he was very careful?" "I don't know," said Mr. Byrd, but remembering the model, added with quick assurance, "I have no doubt he did," which seemed to satisfy the other, for he at once cried, "I recollect such a person very well. I noticed him before he got to the station, as soon, in fact, as he came in sight. He was walking down the highway and seemed to be thinking of something. He's of the kind to attract attention. What about him, sir?" "Nothing. He was in trouble of some kind, and he went from home without saying where he was going, and his friends are anxious about him. That is all. Do you think you could swear to his face if you saw it?" "I think I could. He was the only stranger that got on to the cars that afternoon." "Do you remember, then, the day?" "Well, no, now I don't." "But can't you, if you try? Wasn't there something done by you that day which will assist your memory?" Again that slow "let me see" showed that the man was pondering. Suddenly he slapped his thigh and exclaimed, "You might be a lawyer's clerk now, mightn't you? Or perhaps a lawyer himself. I do remember that a large load of stone was sent off that day, and a minute's look at my book—" "It was Tuesday," he presently affirmed. Mr. Byrd drew a deep breath. There is sadness mixed with the satisfaction of such a triumph. "I am much obliged to you," he said, in acknowledgment of the other's trouble. "The friends of this gentleman will now have little difficulty in tracing him. There is but one thing further I should like to make sure of." And taking from his memorandum book the picture he kept concealed there, he showed him the face of Mr. Mansell, now altered to a perfect likeness, and asked him if he recognized it. The decided yes which he received made further questions unnecessary. End of chapter 15. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Storm. Oh, my offence is rank, it smells to heaven, it hath the primal eldest curse upon it. Hamlet. A day had passed. Mr. Byrd, who no longer had any reason to doubt that he was upon the trail of the real assailant of the widow Clemmens, had resolved upon a third visit to the woods, this time with the definite object of picking up any clue, however trifling, in support of the fact that Craik Mansell had passed through the glade behind his aunt's house. The sky, when he left the hotel, was one vast field of blue, but by the time he reached the terminus of the car route, stepped out upon the road leading to the woods, dark clouds had overcast the sun, and a cool wind replaced the quiet zephyrs which had all day fanned the brilliant autumn foliage. He did not realize the condition of the atmosphere, however, and proceeded on his way, thinking more of the person he had just perceived issuing from the doorway of Professor Darling's lofty mansion, than of the low mutterings of distant thunder that now and then disturbed the silence of the woods, or of the ominous brazen tint which was slowly settling over the huge bank of clouds that filled the northern sky. For that person was Miss Dare, and her presence here, or anywhere near him, at this time, must of necessity awaken a most painful train of thought. But, though unmindful of the storm, he was dimly conscious of the darkness that was settling about him. Quicker and quicker grew his pace, and at last he almost broke into a run as the heavy pall of a large black cloud swept up over the zenith and wiped from the heavens the last remnant of blue sky. One drop fell, then another, then a slow, heavy patter that bent double the leaves they fell upon, as if a shower of lead had descended upon the heavily writhing forest. The wind had risen, too, and the vast aisles of that clear and beautiful woods thundered with the swaying of boughs and the crash here and there of an old and falling limb. But the lightning delayed. The blindest or most abstracted man could be ignorant no longer of what all this turmoil meant. Stopping in the path along which he had been speeding, Mr. Byrd glanced before him and behind, in a momentary calculation of distances, and deciding he could not regain the terminus before the storm burst, pushed on toward the hut. He reached it just as the first flash of lightning darted down through the heavy darkness, and was about to fling himself against the door, when something, was it the touch of an invisible hand, or the crash of awful thunder which at this instant ploughed up the silence of the forest and woke a pandemonium of echoes about his head, stopped him? He never knew. He only realized that he shuddered and drew back with a feeling of great disinclination to enter the low building before him, alone, and that presently taking advantage of another loud crash of falling boughs, he crept around the corner of the hut and satisfied his doubts by looking into the small square window opening to the west. He found there was ample reason for all the hesitation he had felt. A man was sitting there, who at the first glimpse appeared to him to be none other than Craik Mansell, but reason soon assured him that this could not be, though the shape, the attitude, that old attitude of despair which he remembered so well, was so startlingly like that of the man whose name was uppermost in his thoughts that he recoiled in spite of himself. A second flash swept blindingly through the woods. Mr. Byrd advanced his head and took another glance at the stranger. It was Mr. Mansell. No other man would sit so quiet and unmoved during the rush and clatter of a terrible storm. Look! Not a hair on his head has stirred, not a movement has taken place in the hands clasped so convulsively beneath his brow. He is an image, a stone, and would not hear though the roof fell in. Mr. Byrd himself forgot the storm, and only queried what his duty was in this strange and surprising emergency. But before he could come to any definite conclusion, he was subjected to a new sensation. A stir that was not the result of the wind or the rain had taken place in the forest before him. A something, he could not tell what, was advancing upon him from the path he had himself travelled so short a time before, and its step, if step it were, shook him with a vague apprehension that made him dread to lift his eyes. But he conquered the unmanly instinct, and merely taking the precaution to step somewhat further back from view, looked in the direction of his fears, and saw a tall, firmly built woman, whose grandly poised head, held high, in defiance of the gale, the lightning, and the rain, proclaimed her to be none other than Imogene Dare. It was a juxtaposition of mental, moral, and physical forces that almost took Mr. Byrd's breath away. He had no doubt whom she had come to see, or to what sort of tryst he was about to be made an unwilling witness. But he could not have moved if the blast then surging through the trees had uprooted the huge pine behind, which he had involuntarily drawn at the first impression he had received of her approach. He must watch that white face of hers slowly evolve itself from the surrounding darkness, and he must be present when the dreadful bolts swept down from heaven, if only to see her eyes in the flare of its ghostly flame. It came while she was crossing the glade, fierce, blinding, more vivid and searching than at any time before. It flashed down through the cringing boughs, and like a mantle of fire enveloped her form, throwing out its every outline and making of the strong and beautiful face an electric vision which Mr. Byrd was never able to forget. A sudden swoop of wind followed, flinging her almost to the ground, but Mr. Byrd knew from that moment that neither wind nor lightning, not even the fear of death, would stop this woman if once she was determined upon any course. Dreading the next few moments inexpressibly, yet forcing himself, as a detective, to remain at his post, though every instinct of his nature rebelled, Mr. Byrd drew himself up against the side of the low hut and listened. Her voice, rising between the mutterings of thunder and the roar of the ceaseless gale, was plainly to be heard. "Craik Mansell," said she, in a strained tone that was not without its severity, "you sent for me, and I am here." Ah, this was her mode of greeting, was it? Mr. Byrd felt his breath come easier, and listened for the reply with intensest interest. But it did not come. The low rumbling of the thunder went on, and the wind howled through the gruesome forest, but the man she had addressed did not speak. "Craik!" Her voice still came from the doorway where she had seemingly taken her stand. "Do you not hear me?" A stifled groan was the sole reply. She appeared to take one step forward, but no more. "I can understand," said she, and Mr. Byrd had no difficulty in hearing her words, though the turmoil overhead was almost deafening. "Why the restlessness of despair should drive you into seeking this interview, I have longed to see you too, if only to tell you that I wish Heaven's thunderbolts had fallen upon us both on that day when we sat and talked of our future prospects, and—" A lurid flash cut short her words. Strange and awesome sounds awoke in the air above, and the next moment a great branch fell crashing down upon the roof of the hut, beating in one corner, and sliding thence heavily to the ground, where it lay with all its quivering leaves uppermost, not 2 feet from the doorway where this woman stood. A shriek like that of a lost spirit went up from her lips. "I thought the vengeance of Heaven had fallen," she gasped, and for a moment not a sound was heard within or without the hut, save that low flutter of the disturbed leaves. "It is not to be," she then whispered, with a return of her old calmness, that was worse than any shriek. "Murder is not to be avenged thus." Then shortly, "A dark and hideous line of blood is drawn between you and me, Craik Mansell. I cannot pass it, and you must not, forever and forever and forever. But that does not hinder me from wishing to help you, and so I ask in all sincerity what it is you want me to do for you to day." A response came this time. "Show me how to escape the consequences of my act," were his words, uttered in a low and muffled voice. She did not answer at once. "Are you threatened?" she inquired at last, in a tone that proved she had drawn one step nearer to the bowed form and hidden face of the person she addressed. "My conscience threatens me," was the almost stifled reply. Again the heavy silence, all the more impressive that the moments before had been so prolific of heaven's most terrible noises. "You suffer because another man is forced to endure suspicion for a crime he never committed?" she whisperingly exclaimed. Only a groan answered her, and the moments grew heavier and heavier, more and more oppressive, though the hitherto accompanying outcries of the forest had ceased, and a faint lightening of the heavy darkness was taking place overhead. Mr. Byrd felt the pressure of the situation so powerfully, he drew near to the window he had hitherto avoided, and looked in. She was standing a foot behind the crouched figure of the man between whom and herself she had avowed a line of blood to be drawn. As he looked, she spoke. "Craik," said she, and the deathless yearning of love spoke in her voice at last, "there is but one thing to do. Expiate your guilt by acknowledging it. Save the innocent from unmerited suspicion, and trust to the mercy of God. It is the only advice I can give you. I know no other road to peace. If I did—" She stopped, choked by the terror of her own thoughts. "Craik," she murmured at last, "on the day I hear of your having made this confession, I vow to take an oath of celibacy for life. It is the only recompense I can offer for the misery and sin into which our mutual mad ambitions have plunged you." And subduing with a look of inexpressible anguish an evident longing to lay her hand in final caress upon that bended head, she gave him one parting look, and then with a quick shudder hurried away and buried herself amid the darkness of the wet and shivering woods. End of chapter 16. And 17 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17. A Surprise. Season your admiration for a while. Hamlet. When all was still again, Mr. Byrd advanced from his place of concealment and softly entered the hut. Its solitary occupant sat as before, with his head bent down upon his clasped hands. But at the first sound of Mr. Byrd's approach, he rose and turned. The shock of the discovery which followed sent the detective reeling back against the door. The person who faced him with such quiet assurance was not Craik Mansell. End of chapter 17. Section 18 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18. A Brace of Detectives. Hath this fellow no feeling of his business? Hamlet. No action, whether foul or fair, is ever done but it leaves somewhere a record. Longfellow. So there are two of us. I thought as much when I first set eyes upon your face in Buffalo. This exclamation, uttered in a dry and musing tone, woke Mr. Byrd from the stupor into which this astonishing discovery had thrown him. Advancing upon the stranger, who in size, shape, and coloring was almost the facsimile of the person he had so successfully represented, Mr. Byrd looked him scrutinizingly over. The man bore the ordeal with equanimity. He even smiled. "You don't recognize me, I see." Mr. Byrd at once recoiled. "Ah," cried he, "you are that Jack-in-the-box Brown, alias Frank Hickory, at your service." This name, so unexpected, called up a flush of mingled surprise and indignation to Mr. Byrd's cheek. "I thought," he began. "Don't think," interrupted the other, who, when excited, affected laconicism. "No." Then with affability proceeded, "You are the gentleman," he paid that much deference to Mr. Byrd's air and manner, "who I was told might lend me a helping hand in this Clemmens affair. I didn't recognize you before, sir. Wouldn't have stood in your way if I had. Though, to be sure, I did want to see this matter through myself. I thought I had the right, and I've done it, too, as you must acknowledge, if you have been present in this terrible place very long." This self-satisfied, if not boastful allusion to a scene in which this strange being had played so unworthy, if not unjustifiable, a part, sent a thrill of revulsion through Mr. Byrd. Drawing hastily back with an instinct of dislike he could not conceal, he cast a glance through the thicket of trees that spread beyond the open door, and pointedly asked, "Was there no way of satisfying yourself of the guilt of Craik Mansell except by enacting a farce that may lead to the lifelong remorse of the woman out of whose love you have made a trap?" A slow flush, the first possibly that had visited the hardy cheek of this thick-skinned detective for years, crept over the face of Frank Hickory. "I don't mean she shall ever know," he sullenly protested, kicking at the block upon which he had been sitting. "But it was a mean trick," he frankly enough admitted the next moment. "If I hadn't been the tough old hickory knot that I am, I couldn't have done it, I suppose. The storm, too, made it seem a bit trifling. But well, well," he suddenly interjected in a more cheerful tone, "'tis too late now for tears and repentance. The thing is done and can't be undone, and at all events I reckon we are both satisfied now as to who killed Widow Clemmens." Mr. Byrd could not resist a slight sarcasm. "I thought you were satisfied in that regard before," said he. "At least I understood that at a certain time you were very positive it was Mr. Hildreth." "So I was," the fellow good naturedly allowed. "So I was. The byways of a crime like this are dreadful dark and uncertain. It isn't strange that a fellow gets lost sometimes. But I got a jog on my elbow that sent me into the right path," said he, "as perhaps you did too, sir, eh?" Not replying to this latter insinuation, Mr. Byrd quietly repeated, "You got a jog on your elbow? When, may I ask?" "3 days ago, just," was the emphatic reply. "And from whom?" Instead of replying, the man leaned back against the wall of the hut and looked at his interlocutor in silence. "Are we going to join hands over this business?" he cried at last. "Or are you thinking of pushing your way on alone after you have got from me all that I know?" The question took Mr. Byrd by surprise. He had not thought of the future. He was as yet too much disturbed by his memories of the past. To hide his discomfiture, he began to pace the floor, an operation which his thoroughly wet condition certainly made advisable. "I have no wish to rob you of any glory you may hope to reap from the success of the plot you have carried on here to day," he presently declared, with some bitterness. "But if this Craik Mansell is guilty, I suppose it is my duty to help you in the collection of all suitable and proper evidence against him." "Then," said the other, who had been watching him with rather an anxious eye, "let us to work." And sitting down on the table, he motioned to Mr. Byrd to take a seat upon the block at his side. But the latter kept up his walk. Hickory surveyed him for a moment in silence. Then he said, "You must have something against this young man, or you wouldn't be here. What is it? What first set you thinking about Craik Mansell?" Now this was a question Mr. Byrd could not and would not answer. After what had just passed in the hut, he felt it impossible to mention to this man the name of Imogene Dare in connection with that of the nephew of Mrs. Clemmens. He therefore waived the other's interrogation and remarked, "My knowledge was rather the fruit of surmise than fact. I did not believe in the guilt of Gouverneur Hildreth, and was so forced to look about me for some one whom I could conscientiously suspect. I fixed upon this unhappy man in Buffalo. How truly your own suspicions unfortunately reveal." "And I had to have my wits started by a horrid old woman," murmured the evidently abashed Hickory. "Horrid old woman?" repeated Mr. Byrd. "Not Sally Perkins?" "Yes, a sweet one, isn't she?" Mr. Byrd shuddered. "Tell me about it," said he, coming and sitting down in the seat the other had previously indicated to him. "I will, sir, I will. But first let's look at the weather. Some folks would think it just as well for you to change that toggery of yours. What do you say to going home first and talking afterward?" "I suppose it would be wise," admitted Mr. Byrd, looking down at his garments, whose decidedly damp condition he had scarcely noticed in his excitement. "And yet I hate to leave this spot till I learn how you came to choose it as the scene of the tragic comedy you have enacted here to day, and what position it is likely to occupy in the testimony which you have collected against this young man." "Wait, then," said the bustling fellow, "till I build you the least bit of a fire to warm you. It won't take but a minute," he averred, piling together some old sticks that cumbered the hearth, and straightway setting a match to them. "See, isn't that pleasant? And now, just cast your eye at this," he continued, drawing a comfortable-looking flask out of his pocket and handing it over to the other with a dry laugh. "Isn't this pleasant?" And he threw himself down on the floor and stretched out his hands to the blaze, with a gusto which the dreary hour he had undoubtedly passed made perfectly natural, if not excusable. "I thank you," said Mr. Byrd. "I didn't know I was so chilled." And he, too, enjoyed the warmth. "And now," he pursued, after a moment, "go on. Let us have the thing out at once." But the other was in no hurry. "Very good, sir," he cried. "But first, if you don't mind, suppose you tell me what brought you to this hut to day?" "I was on the lookout for clues. In my study of the situation, I decided that the murderer of Mrs. Clemmens escaped, not from the front, but from the back of the house. Taking the path I imagined him to have trod, I came upon this hut. It naturally attracted my attention, and today I came back to examine it more closely in the hope of picking up some signs of his having been here, or at least having passed through the glade on his way to the deeper woods." "And what if you had succeeded in this, sir? What if some token of his presence had rewarded your search?" "I should have completed a chain of proof of which only this one link is lacking. I could have shown how Craik Mansell fled from this place on last Tuesday afternoon, making his way through the woods to the highway, and thence to the quarry station at Monteith, where he took the train which carried him back to Buffalo." "You could? Show me how." Mr. Byrd explained himself more definitely. Hickory at once rose. "I guess we can give you the link," he dryly remarked. "At all events, suppose you just step here and tell me what conclusion you draw from the appearance of this pile of brush." Mr. Byrd advanced and looked at a small heap of hemlock that lay in a compact mass in one corner. "I have not disturbed it," pursued the other. "It is just as it was when I found it." "Looks like a pillow," declared Mr. Byrd. "Has been used for such, I am sure. For see, the dust in this portion of the floor lies lighter than elsewhere. You can almost detect the outline of a man's recumbent form," he went on, slowly, leaning down to examine the floor more closely. "As for the boughs, they have been cut from the tree with a knife, and," lifting up a sprig, he looked at it, then passed it over to Hickory with a meaning glance that directed attention to one or two short hairs of dark brown color that were caught in the rough bark. "He did not even throw his pocket handkerchief over the heap before lying down," he observed. Mr. Hickory smiled. "You are up in your business, I see," and drawing his new colleague to the table, he asked him what he saw there. At first sight, Mr. Byrd exclaimed nothing, but in another moment he picked up an infinitesimal chip from between the rough logs that formed the top of this somewhat rustic piece of furniture, and turning it over in his hand, pronounced it to be a piece of wood from a lead pencil. "Here are several of them," remarked Mr. Hickory, "and what is more, it is easy to tell just the color of the pencil from which they were cut. It was blue." "That is so," assented Mr. Byrd. "Quarrymen, charcoal burners, and the like are not much in the habit of sharpening pencils," suggested Hickory. "Is the pencil now to be found in the pocket of Mr. Mansell a blue one?" "It is." "Have you anything more to show me?" asked Mr. Byrd. "Only this," responded the other, taking out of his pocket the torn off corner of a newspaper. "I found this blowing about under the bushes out there," said he. "Look at it, and tell me from what paper it was torn." "I don't know," said Mr. Byrd. "None that I am acquainted with." "You don't read the Buffalo Courier?" "Oh, is this?" "A corner from the Buffalo Courier. I don't know, but I mean to find out. If it is, and the date proves to be correct, we won't have much trouble about the little link, will we?" Mr. Byrd shook his head, and they again crouched down over the fire. "And now, what did you learn in Buffalo?" inquired the persistent Hickory. "Not much," acknowledged Mr. Byrd. "The man Brown was entirely too ubiquitous to give me my full chance. Neither at the house nor at the mill was I able to glean any thing beyond an admission from the landlady that Mr. Mansell was not at home at the time of his aunt's murder. I couldn't even learn where he was on that day, or where he had ostensibly gone. If it had not been for the little girl of Mr. Goodman—" "Ah, I had no time to go to that house," interjected the other suggestively. "I should have come home as wise as I went," continued Mr. Byrd. "She told me that on the day before Mr. Mansell returned he wrote to her father from Monteith, and that settled my mind in regard to him. It was pure luck, however." The other laughed long and loud. "I didn't know I did it up so well," he cried. "I told the landlady you were a detective, or acted like one, and she was very ready to take the alarm, having, as I judge, a motherly liking for her young boarder. Then I took Messrs. Chamberlain and Harrison into my confidence, and having got from them all the information they could give me, told them there was evidently another man on the track of this Mansell, and warned them to keep silence till they heard from the prosecuting attorney in Sibley. But I didn't know who you were, or, at least, I wasn't sure, or, as I said before, I shouldn't have presumed." The short, dry laugh with which he ended this explanation had not ceased when Mr. Byrd observed: "You have not told me what you gathered in Buffalo." "Much," quoth Hickory, reverting to his favorite laconic mode of speech. "First, that Mansell went from home on Monday, the day before the murder, for the purpose, as he said, of seeing a man in New York about his wonderful invention. Secondly, that he never went to New York, but came back the next evening, bringing his model with him and looking terribly used up and worried. Thirdly, that to get this invention before the public had been his pet aim and effort for a whole year, that he believed in it as you do in your Bible, and would have given his heart's blood, if it would have done any good, to start the thing and prove himself right in his estimate of its value. The money to do this was all that was lacking, no one believing in him sufficiently to advance him the $5,000 considered necessary to build the machine and get it in working order. That, in short, he was a fanatic on the subject, and often said he would be willing to die within the year if he could first prove to the unbelieving capitalists whom he had vainly importuned for assistance the worth of the discovery he believed himself to have made. Fourthly, but what is it you wish to say, sir?" $5,000 is just the amount Widow Clemmens is supposed to leave him," remarked Mr. Byrd. "Precisely," was the short reply. "And fourthly?" suggested the former. "Fourthly, he was in the mill on Wednesday morning, where he went about his work as usual, until some one who knew his relation to Mrs. Clemmens looked up from the paper he was reading, and, in pure thoughtlessness, cried, So they have killed your aunt for you, have they?" A barbarous jest that caused everybody near him to start in indignation, but which made him recoil as if one of these thunderbolts we have been listening to this afternoon had fallen at his feet. "And he didn't get over it," Hickory went on. "He had to beg permission to go home. He said the terrible news had made him ill, and indeed he looked sick enough, and continued to look sick enough for days. He had letters from Sibley, and an invitation to attend the inquest and be present at the funeral services, but he refused to go. He was threatened with diphtheria, he declared, and remained away from the mill until the day before yesterday. Some one, I don't remember who, says he went out of town the very Wednesday he first heard the news, but if so, he could not have been gone long, for he was at home Wednesday night, sick in bed, and threatened, as I have said, with diphtheria. Fifthly, well, fifthly, I'm afraid of your criticisms, laughed the rough detective. Fifthly is the result of my poking about among Mr. Mansell's traps. Ah, frowned the other, with a vivid remembrance of that picture of Miss Dare, with its beauty blotted out by the ominous black lines. You are too squeamish for a detective, the other declared. Guess you're kept for the fancy business, eh? The look Mr. Byrd gave him was eloquent. Go on, said he. Let us hear what lies behind your fifthly. Love, returned the man. Locked in the drawer of this young gentleman's table, I found some half-dozen letters tied with a black ribbon. I knew they were written by a lady, but squeamishness is not a fault of mine, and so I just allowed myself to glance over them. They were from Miss Dare, of course, and they revealed the fact that love, as well as ambition, had been a motive power in determining this Mansell to make a success out of his invention. Leaning back, the now self-satisfied detective looked at Mr. Byrd. The name of Miss Dare, he went on, brings me to the point from which we started. I haven't yet told you what old Sally Perkins had to say to me. No, rejoined Mr. Byrd. Well, continued the other, poking with his foot the dying embers of the fire till it started up into a fresh blaze. The case against this young fellow wouldn't be worth very much without that old crone's testimony, I reckon. But with it, I guess we can get along. Let us hear, said Mr. Byrd. The old woman is a wretch, Hickory suddenly broke out. She seems to gloat over the fact that a young and beautiful woman is in trouble. She actually trembled with eagerness as she told her story. If I hadn't been rather anxious myself to hear what she had to say, I could have thrown her out the window. As it was, I let her go on. Duty before pleasure, you see. Duty before pleasure. But her story, persisted Mr. Byrd, letting some of his secret irritation betray itself. Well, her story was this. Monday afternoon, the day before the murder, you know, she was up in these very woods hunting for witch hazel. She had got her arms full, and was going home across the bog when she suddenly heard voices. Being of a curious disposition, like myself, I suppose, she stopped, and seeing just before her a young gentleman and lady sitting on an old stump, crouched down in the shallow of a tree, with the harmless intent, no doubt, of amusing herself with their conversation. It was more interesting than she expected, and she really became quite tragic as she related her story to me. I cannot do justice to it myself, and I shan't try. It is enough that the man whom she did not know and the woman whom she immediately recognized as Miss Dare were both in a state of great indignation, that he spoke of selfishness and obstinacy on the part of his aunt, and that she, in the place of rebuking him, replied in a way to increase his bitterness, and led him finally to exclaim, I cannot bear it, to think that with just the advance of the very sum she proposes to give me some day, I could make her fortune and my own, and win you, all in one breath. It is enough to drive a man mad to see all that he craves in this world so near his grasp, and yet have nothing, not even hope, to comfort him." And at that, it seems, they both rose, and she, who had not answered anything to this, struck the tree before which they stood with her bare fist, and murmured a word or so which the old woman couldn't catch, but which was evidently something to the effect that she wished she knew Mrs. Clemmens, for Mansell, of course it was he, said, in almost the same breath, "And if you did know her, what then?" A question which elicited no reply at first, but which finally led her to say, "Oh, I think that, possibly, I might be able to persuade her." All this, the detective went on, old Sally related with the greatest force, but in regard to what followed she was not so clear. Probably they interrupted their conversation with some lover's by-play, for they stood very near together, and he seemed to be earnestly pleading with her. "Do take it," old Sally heard him say. "I shall feel as if life held some outlook for me, if you will only gratify me in this respect." But she answered, "No, it is of no use. I am as ambitious as you are, and fate is evidently against us," and put his hand back when he endeavored to take hers, but finally yielded so far as to give it to him for a moment, though she immediately snatched it away, again crying, "I cannot. You must wait till tomorrow." And when he asked, "Why tomorrow?" she answered, "A night has been known to change the whole current of a person's affairs." To which he replied, "True," and looked thoughtful, very thoughtful, as he met her eyes and saw her raise that white hand of hers and strike the tree again with a passionate force that made her fingers bleed. "And she was right," concluded the speaker. "That night, or if not that night, the next 24 hours, did make a change, as even old Sally Perkins observed. Widow Clemmens was struck down, and Craik Mansell became the possessor of the $5,000 he so much wanted in order to win for himself a fortune and a bride." Mr. Byrd, who had been sitting with his face turned aside during this long recital, slowly rose to his feet. "Hickory," said he, and his tone had an edge of suppressed feelings in it that made the other start, "don't ever let me hear you say in my presence that you think this young and beautiful woman was the one to suggest murder to this man, for I won't hear it. And now," he continued more calmly, "tell me why this babbling old wretch did not enliven the inquest with her wonderful tale. It would have been a fine offset to the testimony of Miss Firman. She said she wasn't fond of coroners, and had no wish to draw the attention of 12 of her own town folk upon herself. She didn't mean to commit herself with me," pursued Hickory, rising also. "She was going to give me a hint of the real state of affairs, or rather, set me working in the right direction, as this little note which she tucked under the door of my room at the hotel will show. But I was too quick for her, and had her by the arm before she could shuffle down the stairs. It was partly to prove her story was true, and not a romance made up for the occasion, that I lured this woman here this afternoon." "You are not as bad a fellow as I thought," Mr. Byrd admitted, after a momentary contemplation of the other's face. "If I might only know how you managed to effect this interview." "Nothing easier. I found in looking over the scraps of paper which Mansell had thrown into the waste paper basket in Buffalo the draft of a note which he had written to Miss Dare, under an impulse which he afterward probably regretted. It was a summons to their usual place of tryst at or near this hut, and though unsigned, was of a character, as I thought, to effect its purpose. I just sent it to her, that's all." The nonchalance with which this was said completed Mr. Byrd's astonishment. "You are a worthy disciple of Gryce," he asserted, leading the way to the door. "Think so?" exclaimed the man, evidently flattered at what he considered a great compliment. "Then shake hands," he cried, with a frank appeal Mr. Byrd found it hard to resist. "Ah, don't you want to?" he somewhat ruefully declared. "Will it change your feelings any if I promise to ignore what happened here to day? My trick with Miss Dare and what she revealed, and all that? If it will, I swear I won't even think of it any more if I can help it. And at all events, I won't tattle about it, even to the superintendent. It shall be a secret between you and me, and she won't know but what it was her lover she talked to after all." "You are willing to do all this?" inquired Mr. Byrd. "Willing and ready," cried the man. "I believe in duty to one's superiors, but duty doesn't always demand of one to tell everything he knows. Besides, it won't be necessary, I imagine. There is enough against this poor fellow without that." "I fear so," ejaculated Mr. Byrd. "Then it is a bargain?" said Hickory. "Yes." And Mr. Byrd held out his hand. The rain had now ceased, and they prepared to return home. Before leaving the glade, however, Mr. Byrd ran his eye over the other's person and apparel, and in some wonder inquired, "How do you fellows ever manage to get up such complete disguises? I declare you look enough like Mr. Mansell in the back to make me doubt even now who I am talking to." "Oh," laughed the other, "it's easy enough. It's my specialty, you see, and one in which I am thought to excel. But to tell the truth, I hadn't much to contend with in this case. In build I am famously like this man, as you must have noticed when you saw us together in Buffalo. Indeed, it was our similarity in this respect that first put the idea of personifying him into my head. My complexion had been darkened already, and as for such accessories as hair, voice, manner, dress, etc., a 5 minutes' study of my model was sufficient to prime me up in all that, enough, at least, to satisfy the conditions of an interview which did not require me to show my face." "But you did not know when you came here that you would not have to show your face," persisted Mr. Byrd, anxious to understand how this man dared risk his reputation on an undertaking of this kind. "No, and I did not know that the biggest thunderstorm of the season was going to spring up and lend me its darkness to complete the illusion I had attempted. I only trusted my good fortune and my wits," he added, with a droll demureness. "Both had served me before, and both were likely to serve me again. And say she had detected me in my little game, what then? Women like her don't babble." There was no reply to make to this, and Mr. Byrd's thoughts being thus carried back to Imogene Dare and the unhappy revelations she had been led to make, he walked on in a dreary silence his companion had sufficient discretion not to break. Chapter 18. Section 19 of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. Mr. Ferris. "Which of you have done this?" Macbeth. "What have we here?" Tempest. Mr. Ferris sat in his office in a somewhat gloomy frame of mind. There had been bad news from the jail that morning. Mr. Hildreth had attempted suicide the night before, and was now lying in a critical condition at the hospital. Mr. Ferris himself had never doubted this man's guilt. From Hildreth's first appearance at the inquest, the District Attorney had fixed upon him as the murderer of Mrs. Clemmens, and up to this time he had seen no good and substantial reason for altering his opinion. Even the doubts expressed by Mr. Byrd had moved him but little. Mr. Byrd was an enthusiast, and naturally enough shrank from believing a gentleman capable of such a crime. But the other detective's judgment was unswayed, and he considered Hildreth guilty. It was not astonishing, then, that the opinion of Mr. Ferris should coincide with that of the older and more experienced man. But the depths of despair or remorse which led Mr. Hildreth to this desperate attempt upon his own life had struck the District Attorney with dismay. Though not overly sensitive by nature, he could not help feeling sympathy for the misery that had prompted such a deed, and while secretly regarding this unsuccessful attempt at suicide as an additional proof of guilt, he could not forbear satisfying himself by a review of the evidence elicited at the inquest, that the action of the authorities in arresting this man had been both warrantable and necessary. The result was satisfactory in all but one point. When he came to the widow's written accusation against one by the name of Gouverneur Hildreth, he was impressed by a fact that had hitherto escaped his notice. This was the yellowness of the paper upon which the words were written. If they had been transcribed a dozen years before, they would not have looked older, nor would the ink have presented a more faded appearance. Now, as the suspected man was under 25 years of age, and must therefore have been a mere child when the paper was drawn up, the probability was that the Gouverneur intended was the prisoner's father, their names being identical. But this discovery, while it robbed the affair of its most dramatic feature, could not affect in any serious way the extreme significance of the remaining real and compromising facts which told so heavily against this unfortunate man. Indeed, the well-known baseness of the father made it easier to distrust the son, and Mr. Ferris had just come to the conclusion that his duty compelled him to draw up an indictment of the would-be suicide when the door opened and Mr. Byrd and Mr. Hickory came in. To see these two men in conjunction was a surprise to the District Attorney. He, however, had no time to express himself on the subject, for Mr. Byrd, stepping forward, immediately remarked: "Mr. Hickory and I have been in consultation, sir, and we have a few facts to give you that we think will alter your opinion as to the person who murdered Mrs. Clemmens." "Is that so?" cried Mr. Ferris, looking at Hickory with a glance indicative of doubt. "Yes, sir," exclaimed that not easily abashed individual, with an emphasis decided enough to show the state of his feelings on the subject. "After I last saw you, a woman came in my way and put into my hands so fresh and promising a clue that I dropped the old scent at once and made instanter for the new game. But I soon found I was not the only sportsman on this trail. Before I had taken a dozen steps, I ran upon this gentleman, and finding him true grit, struck up a partnership with him that has led to our bringing down the quarry together." "Humph!" quoth the District Attorney. "Some very remarkable discoveries must have come to light to influence the judgment of two such men as yourselves." "You are right," rejoined Mr. Byrd. "In fact, I should not be surprised if this case proved to be one of the most remarkable on record. It is not often that equally convincing evidence of guilt is found against two men having no apparent connection." "And you have collected such evidence?" "We have." "And who is the person you consider equally open to suspicion with Mr. Hildreth?" "Craik Mansell, Mrs. Clemmens' nephew." The surprise of the District Attorney was, as Mr. Hickory in later days remarked, nuts to him. The solemn nature of the business he was engaged upon never disturbed this hardy detective's sense of the ludicrous, and he indulged in one of his deepest chuckles as he met the eye of Mr. Ferris. "One never knows what they are going to run upon in a chase of this kind, do they, sir?" he remarked, with the greatest cheerfulness. "Mr. Mansell is no more of a gentleman than Mr. Hildreth, yet Because he is the second one of his caste who has attracted our attention, you are naturally very much surprised. But wait till you hear what we have to tell you. I am confident you will be satisfied with our reasons for suspecting this new party." And he glanced at Mr. Byrd, who, seeing no cause for delay, proceeded to unfold before the District Attorney the evidence they had collected against Mr. Mansell. It was strong, telling, and seemingly conclusive, as we already know, and awoke in the mind of Mr. Ferris the greatest perplexity of his life. It was not simply the facts urged against Mr. Mansell were of the same circumstantial character and of almost the same significance as those already urged against Mr. Hildreth, but that the association of Miss Dare's name with this new theory of suspicion presented difficulties, if it did not involve consequences, calculated to make any friend of Mr. Orcutt quail. And Mr. Ferris was such a friend, and he knew very well the violent nature of the shock which this eminent lawyer would experience at discovering the relations held by this trusted woman toward a man suspected of a crime. Then Miss Dare herself, was this beautiful and cherished woman, hitherto believed by all who knew her to be set high above the reach of reproach, to be dragged down from her pedestal and submitted to the curiosity of the rabble, if not to its insinuations and reproach? It seemed hard, even to this stern, dry searcher among dead men's bones. It seemed both hard and bitter, and yet, because he was an honest man, he had no thought of paltering with his duty. He could only take time to make sure what that duty was. He accordingly refrained from expressing any opinion in regard to Mr. Mansell's culpability to the two detectives, and finally dismissed them without any special orders. But a day or two after this he sent for them again and said: "Since I have seen you, I have considered with due carefulness the various facts presented to me in support of your belief that Craig Mansell is the man who assailed the widow Clemmens, and have weighed them against the equally significant facts pointing toward Mr. Hildreth as the guilty party, and find but one link lacking in the former chain of evidence which is not lacking in the latter, and that is this: Mrs. Clemmens, in one or two lucid moments which returned to her after the assault, gave utterance to an exclamation which many think was meant to serve as a guide in determining the person of her murderer. She said, 'Ring,' as Mr. Byrd here will doubtless remember, and then 'hand,' as if she wished to fix upon the minds of those about her that the hand uplifted against her wore a ring. At all events, such a conclusion is plausible enough, and led to my making an experiment yesterday which has forever set the matter at rest in my own mind. I took my stand at the huge clock in her house, just in the attitude she was supposed to occupy when struck, and while in this position ordered my clerk to advance upon me from behind, with his hands clasped about a stick of wood, which he was to bring down within an inch of my head. This was done, and while this arm was in the act of descending, I looked to see if by a quick glance from the corner of my eye I could detect the broad seal ring I had previously pushed upon his little finger. I discovered that I could, that indeed it was all of the man which I could distinctly see without turning my head completely around. The ring, then, is an important feature in this case, a link without which any chain of evidence, forged for the express purpose of connecting a man with this murder, must necessarily remain incomplete and consequently useless. But amongst the suspicious circumstances brought to bear against Mr. Mansell, I discerned no token of connection between him and any such article, while we all know that Mr. Hildreth not only wore a ring on the day of the murder, but considered the circumstances so much in his own disfavor that he slipped it off his finger when he began to see the shadow of suspicion falling upon him. "You have, then, forgotten the diamond I picked up from the floor of Mrs. Clemmens' dining room on the morning of the murder?" suggested Mr. Byrd, with great reluctance. "No," answered the District Attorney, shortly. "But Miss Dare distinctly avowed that ring to be hers, and you have brought me no evidence as yet to prove her statement false. If you can supply such proof, or if you can show that Mr. Mansell had that ring on his hand when he entered Mrs. Clemmens' house on that fatal morning, another fact which, by the way, rests as yet upon inference only, I shall consider the case against him as strong as that against Mr. Hildreth, otherwise not." But Mr. Byrd, with a vivid remembrance before him of Miss Dare's looks and actions in the scene he had witnessed between her and the supposed Mansell in the hut, smiled with secret bitterness over this attempt of the District Attorney to shut his eyes to the evident guiltiness of this man. Mr. Ferris saw this smile and instantly became irritated. "I do not doubt any more than yourself," he resumed, in a changed voice, "that this young man allowed his mind to dwell upon the possible advantages which might accrue to himself if his aunt should die. He may even have gone so far as to meditate the commission of a crime to insure these advantages. But whether the crime which did indeed take place the next day in his aunt's house was the result of his meditations, or whether he found his own purpose forestalled by an attack made by another person possessing no less interest than himself in seeing this woman dead, is not determined by the evidence you bring." "Then you do not favor his arrest?" inquired Mr. Byrd. "No. The vigorous measures which were taken in Mr. Hildreth's case, and the unfortunate event to which they have led, are terrible enough to satisfy the public craving after excitement for a week at least. I am not fond of driving men to madness myself, and unless I can be made to see that my duty demands a complete transferal of my suspicions from Hildreth to Mansell, I can advise nothing more than a close but secret surveillance of the latter's movements until the action of the grand jury determines whether the evidence against Mr. Hildreth is sufficient to hold him for trial." Mr. Byrd, who had such solid, if private and uncommunicable, reasons for believing in the guilt of Craig Mansell, was somewhat taken back at this unlooked-for decision of Mr. Ferris, and remembering the temptation which a man like Hickory must feel to make his cause good at all hazards, cast a sharp look toward the blunt-spoken detective, in some doubt as to whether he could be relied upon to keep his promise in the face of this manifest disappointment. But Hickory had given his words, and Hickory remained firm, and Mr. Byrd, somewhat relieved in his own mind, was about to utter his acquiescence in the District Attorney's views when a momentary interruption occurred which gave him an opportunity to exchange a few words aside with his colleague. "Hickory," he whispered, "what do you think of this objection which Mr. Ferris makes?" "I," was the hurried reply. "Oh, I think there is something in it." "Something in it?" "Yes. Mr. Mansell is the last man to wear a ring, I must acknowledge. Indeed, I took some pains while in Buffalo to find out if he ever indulged in such vanity, and was told decidedly no. As to the diamond you mentioned, that is certainly entirely too rich a jewel for a man like him to possess. I am afraid the absence of this link in our chain of evidence is fatal. I shouldn't wonder if the old scent was the best, after all." "But Miss Dare, her feelings and her convictions, as manifested by the words she made use of in the hut," objected Mr. Byrd. "Oh, she thinks he is guilty, of course." "She thinks?" Mr. Byrd stared at his companion for a minute in silence. "She thinks? Then there was a possibility, it seems, that it was only her thought, and that Mr. Mansell was not really the culpable man he had been brought to consider him. But here an exclamation uttered by Mr. Ferris called their attention back to that gentleman. He was reading a letter which had evidently been just brought in, and his expression was one of amazement, mixed with doubt. As they looked toward him, they met his eye, that had a troubled and somewhat abashed expression, which convinced them that the communication he held in his hand was in some way connected with the matter under consideration. Surprised themselves, they unconsciously started forward when, in a dry and not altogether pleased tone, the District Attorney observed: "This affair seems to be full of coincidence. You talk of a missing link, and it is immediately thrust under your nose. Read that." And he pushed toward them the following epistle, roughly scrawled on a sheet of common writing paper: "If Mr. Ferris is anxious for justice, and can believe that suspicion does not always attach itself to the guilty, let him, or some one whose business it is, inquire of Miss Imogene Dare of this town how she came to claim as her own the ring that was picked up on the floor of Mrs. Clemmens' house." "Well," cried Mr. Byrd, glancing at Hickory, "what are we to think of this?" "Looks like the work of old Sally Perkins," observed the other, pointing out the lack of date and signature. "So it does," acquiesced Mr. Byrd in a relieved tone. "The miserable old wretch is growing impatient." But Mr. Ferris, with a gloomy frown, shortly said: "The language is not that of an ignorant old creature like Sally Perkins, whatever the writing may be. Besides, how could she have known about the ring? The persons who were present at the time it was picked up are not of the gossiping order." "Who, then, do you think wrote this?" inquired Mr. Byrd. "That is what I wish you to find out," declared the District Attorney. Mr. Hickory at once took it in his hand. "Wait," he said, "I have an idea." And he carried the letter to one side, where he stood examining it for several minutes. When he came back he looked tolerably excited and somewhat pleased. "I believe I can tell you who wrote it," said he. "Who?" inquired the District Attorney. For reply the detective placed his finger upon a name that was written in the letter. "Imogene Dare!" exclaimed Mr. Ferris, astonished. "She herself," proclaimed the self-satisfied detective. "What makes you think that?" the District Attorney slowly asked. "Because I have seen her writing and studied her signature, and ably as she has disguised her hand in the rest of the letter, it betrays itself in her name. See here." And Hickory took from his pocketbook a small slip of paper containing her autograph, and submitted it to the test of comparison. The similarity between the two signatures was evident, and both Mr. Byrd and Mr. Ferris were obliged to allow the detective might be right, though the admission opened up suggestions of the most formidable character. "It is a turn for which I am not prepared," declared the District Attorney. "It is a turn for which we are not prepared," repeated Mr. Byrd, with a controlling look at Hickory. "Let us, then, defer further consideration of the matter till I have had an opportunity to see Miss Dare," suggested Mr. Ferris. And the two detectives were very glad to acquiesce in this, for they were as much astonished as he at this action of Miss Dare, though, with their better knowledge of her feelings, they found it comparatively easy to understand how her remorse and the great anxiety she doubtless felt for Mr. Hildreth had sufficed to drive her to such an extreme and desperate measure. End of chapter 19. Of Hand and Ring by Anna Katharine Green. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. A Crisis. Queen. Alas, how is it with you, that you do bend your eye on vacancy, and with the incorporeal air do hold discourse. Your bedded hair, like life in excrements, starts up and stands on end. Whereon do you look? Hamlet. On him, on him. Look you, how pale he glares! His form and cause conjoined, preaching to stones, would make them capable. Do not look upon me, lest, with this piteous action, you convert my stern effects. Then what I have to do will want true color, tears perchance for blood. Hamlet. That my readers may understand even better than Bird and Hickory how it was that Imogene came to write this letter, I must ask them to consider certain incidents that had occurred in a quarter far removed from the eye of the detectives. Mr. Orcutt's mind had never been at rest concerning the peculiar attitude assumed by Imogene Dare at the time of Mrs. Clemmens' murder. Time and thought had not made it any more possible for him to believe now than then that she knew anything of the matter beyond what appeared to the general eye. But he could not forget the ring. It haunted him. 50 times a day he asked himself what she had meant by claiming as her own a jewel which had been picked up from the floor of a strange house at a time so dreadful, and which, in despite of her explanations to him, he found it impossible to believe was hers or ever could have been hers. He was even tempted to ask her, but he never did. The words would not come. Though they faltered again and again upon his lips, he could not give utterance to them. No, though with every passing day he felt like the bond uniting her to him was growing weaker and weaker, and that if something did not soon intervene to establish confidence between them, he would presently lose all hope of the treasure for the possession of which he was now ready to barter away half the remaining years of his life. Her increasing reticence and the almost stony look of misery that now confronted him without let or hindrance from her wide gray eyes were not calculated to reassure him or make his future prospects look any brighter. Her pain, if pain it were, or remorse, if remorse it could be, was not of a kind to feel the influence of time, and struck with dismay, alarm, in spite of himself, if not for her reason, at least for his own, he watched her from day to day, feeling that now he would give his life not merely to possess her, but to understand her and the secret that was gnawing at her heart. At last there came a day when he could no longer restrain himself. She had been seated in his presence, and had been handed a letter which for the moment seemed to thoroughly overwhelm her. We know what that letter was. It was the note which had been sent as a decoy by the detective Hickory, but which she had no reason to doubt was a real communication from Craik Mansell, despite the strange handwriting on the envelope. It prayed her for an interview. It set the time and mentioned the place of meeting, and created for the instant such a turmoil in her usually steady brain that she could not hide it from the searching eyes that watched her. "What is it, Imogene?" inquired Mr. Orcutt, drawing near her with a gesture of such uncontrollable anxiety it looked as if he were about to snatch the letter from her hand. For reply she rose, walked to the grate, in which a low wood fire was burning, and plunged the paper in among the coals. When it was all consumed, she turned and faced Mr. Orcutt. "You must excuse me," she murmured, "but the letter was one which I absolutely desired no one to see." But he did not seem to hear her apology. He stood with his gaze fixed on the fire, and his hand clenched against his heart, as if something in the fate of that wretched sheet of paper reminded him of the love and hope that were shriveling up before his eyes. She saw his look, and drooped her head, with a sudden low moan of mingled shame and suffering. "Am I killing you?" she faintly cried. "Are my strange wild ways driving you to despair? I had not thought of that. I am so selfish. I had not thought of that." This evidence of feeling, the first she had ever shown him, moved Mr. Orcutt deeply. Advancing toward her with sudden passion, he took her by the hand. "Killing me?" he repeated. "Yes, you are killing me. Don't you see how fast I am growing old? Don't you see how the dust lies thick upon the books that used to be my solace and delight? I do not understand you, Imogene. I love you, and I do not understand your grief, or what it is that is affecting you in this terrible way. Tell me, let me know the nature of the forces with which I have to contend, and I can bear all the rest." This appeal, forced as it was from lips unused to prayer, seemed to strike her, absorbed though she was in her own suffering. Looking at him with real concern, she tried to speak, but the words faltered on her tongue. They came at last, however, and he heard her say: "I wish I could weep, if only to show you I am not utterly devoid of womanly sympathy for an anguish I cannot cure. But the fountain of my tears is dried at its source. I do not think I can ever weep again. I am condemned to tread a path of misery and despair, and must traverse it to the end without weakness and without help. Do not ask me why, for I can never tell you, and do not detain me now or try to make me talk, for I must go where I can be alone and silent." She was slipping away, but he caught her by the wrist and drew her back. His pain and perplexity had reached their climax. "You must speak," he cried. "I have paltered long enough with this matter. You must tell me what it is that is destroying your happiness and mine." But her eyes, turning toward him, seemed to echo that "must" in a look of disdain eloquent enough to scorn all help from words, and in the indomitable determination of her whole aspect he saw that he might slay her, but that he could never make her speak. Loosing her with a gesture of despair, he turned away. When he glanced back again, she was gone. The result of this interview was naturally an increased doubt and anxiety on his part. He could not attend to his duties with any degree of precision. He was so haunted by uneasy surmises as to what might have been the contents of the letter which he had thus seen her destroy before his eyes. As for her words, they were like her conduct, an insolvable mystery for which he had no key. His failure to find her at home when he returned that night added to his alarm, especially as he remembered the vivid thunderstorm that had deluged the town in the afternoon. Nor, though she came in very soon and offered both excuses and explanations for her absence, did he experience any appreciable relief, or feel at all satisfied that he was not threatened with some secret and terrible catastrophe. Indeed, the air of vivid and feverish excitement which pervaded every look of hers from this time, making each morning and evening distinctive in his memory as a season of fresh fear and renewed suspense, was enough of itself to arouse this sense of an unknown, but surely approaching danger. He saw that she was on the lookout for some event, he knew not what, and studied the papers as sedulously as she, in the hope of coming upon some revelation that should lay bare the secret of this new condition of hers. At last he thought he had found it. Coming home one day from the court, he called her into his presence, and without pause or preamble, exclaimed, with almost cruel abruptness: "An event of possible interest to you has just taken place. The murderer of Mrs. Clemmens has just cut his throat." He saw that before he had finished the first clause that he had struck at the very citadel of her terrors and her woe. At the end of the second sentence he knew beyond all doubt now what it was she had been fearing, if not expecting. Yet she had not said a word, and by no movement betrayed that the steel had gone through and through her heart. A demon, the maddening demon of jealousy, gripped him for the first time with relentless force. "Ah, you have been looking for it," he cried in a choked voice. "You know this man, then, knew him, perhaps, before the murder of Mrs. Clemmens, knew him, and perhaps loved him." She did not reply. He struck his forehead with his hand, as if the moment was perfectly intolerable to him. "Answer," he cried. "Did you know Gouverneur Hildreth or not?" "Gouverneur Hildreth?" Oh, the sharp surprise, the wailing anguish of her tone! Mr. Orcutt stood amazed. "It is not he who has made this attempt upon his life? Not he?" she shrieked like one appalled. Perhaps because all other expression or emotion failed him, Mr. Orcutt broke forth into a loud and harrowing laugh. "And who else should it be?" he cried. "What other man stands accused of having murdered Widow Clemmens? You are mad, Imogene. You don't know what you say or what you do." "Yes, I am mad," she repeated, "mad," and then leaned her forehead forward on the back of a high chair beside which she had been standing, and hid her face and struggled with herself for a moment, while the clock went on ticking, and the wretched surveyor of her sorrow stood looking at her bended head like a man who does not know whether it is he or she who is in the most danger of losing his reason. At last a word struggled forth from between her clasped hands. "When did it happen?" she gasped, without lifting her head. "Tell me all about it. I think I can understand." The noted lawyer smiled a bitter smile, and spoke for the first time without pity and without mercy. "He has been trying for some days to effect his death. His arrest and the little prospect there is of his escaping trial seem to have maddened his gentlemanly brain. Firearms were not procurable, neither was poison nor a rope, but a pewter plate is enough in the hands of a desperate man. He broke one in two last night, and—" He paused, sick and horror-stricken. Her face had risen upon him from the back of the chair, and was staring upon him like that of a Medusa. Before that gaze the flesh crept on his bones, and the breath of life refused to pass his lips. Gazing at her with rising horror, he saw her stony lips slowly part. "Don't go on," she whispered. "I can see it all without the help of words." Then, in a tone that seemed to come from some far-off world of nightmare, she painfully gasped, "Is he dead?" Mr. Orcutt was a man who, up to the last year, had never known what it was to experience a real and controlling emotion. Life with him had meant success in public affairs, and a certain social preeminence that made his presence in any place the signal of admiring looks and respectful attentions. But let no man think that, because his doom delays, it will never come. Passions such as he had deprecated in others, and desires such as he had believed impossible to himself, had seized upon him with ungovernable power, and in this moment especially he felt himself yielding to their sway with no more power of resistance than a puppet experiences in the grasp of a whirlwind. Meeting that terrible eye of hers, burning with an anxiety for a man he despised, and hearing the agonized question from lips whose touch he had never known, he experienced a sudden, wild, and almost demoniac temptation to hurl back the implacable "yes" that he felt certain would strike her like a dead woman to the ground. But the horrid impulse passed, and, with a quick remembrance of the claims of honor upon one bearing his name and owning his history, he controlled himself with a giant resolution, and merely dropping his eyes from an anguish he dared no longer confront, answered quietly: "No, he has hurt himself severely and has disfigured his good looks for life, but he will not die, or so the physicians think." A long, deep, shuddering sigh swept through the room. "Thank God," came from her lips, and then all was quiet again. He looked up in haste. He could not bear the silence. "Imogene," he began, but instantly paused in surprise at the change which had taken place in her expression. "What do you intend to do?" was his quick demand. "You look as I have never seen you look before." "Don't ask me," she returned. "I have no words for what I am going to do. What you must do is to see that Gouverneur Hildreth is released from prison. He is not guilty, mind you. He never committed this crime of which he is suspected, and in the shame of which suspicion he has this day attempted his life. If he is kept in restraint, which is so humiliating to him, and if he dies there, it will be murder, do you hear? Murder. And he will die there if he's not released. I know his feelings only too well." "But Imogene—" "Hush! Don't argue. 'Tis a matter of life and death, I tell you. He must be released. I know," she went on hurriedly, "what it is you want to say. You think you cannot do this, that the evidence is all against him, that he went to prison of his own free will and cannot hope for release till his guilt or innocence has been properly inquired into. But I know you can effect his enlargement if you will. You are a lawyer and understand all the crooks and turns by which a man can sometimes be made to evade the grasp of justice. Use your knowledge. Avail yourself of your influence with the authorities, and I—" She paused and gave him a long, long look. He was at her side in an instant. "You would what?" he cried, taking her hand in his and pressing it impulsively. "I would grant you whatever you ask," she murmured in a weariful tone. "Would you be my wife?" he passionately inquired. "Yes," was the choked reply, "if I did not die first." He caught her to his breast in rapture. He knelt at her side and threw his arms about her waist. "You shall not die," he cried. "You shall live and be happy. Only marry me to-day." "Not till Gouverneur Hildreth be released," she interposed gently. He started as if touched by a galvanic battery, and slowly rose up and coldly looked at her. "Do you love him so madly you would sell yourself for his sake?" he sternly demanded. With a quick gesture she threw back her head as though the indignant "no" that sprang to her lips would flash out whether she would or not. But she restrained herself in time. "I cannot answer," she returned. But he was master now, master of this dominating spirit that had held him in check for so long a time, and he was not to be put off. "You must answer," he sternly commanded. "I have the right to know the extent of your feeling for this man, and I will. Do you love him, Imogene Dare? Tell me, or here I swear I will do nothing for him, either now or at a time when he may need my assistance more than you know." This threat, uttered as he uttered it, could have but one effect. Turning aside so that he could not see the shuddering revolt in her eyes, she mechanically whispered, "And what if I did? Would it be so very strange? Youth admires youth, Mr. Orcutt, and Mr. Hildreth is very handsome and very unfortunate. Do not oblige me to say more." Mr. Orcutt, across whose face a dozen different emotions had flitted during the utterance of these few words, drew back till half the distance of the room lay between them. "Nor do I wish to hear any more," he rejoined slowly. "You have said enough, quite enough. I understand now all the past, all your terrors, and all your secret doubts and unaccountable behavior. The man you loved was in danger, and you did not know how to manage his release. Well, well, I am sorry for you, Imogene. I wish I could help you. I love you passionately, and would make you my wife in the face of your affection for this man if I could do for you what you request. But it is impossible. Never during the whole course of my career has a blot rested upon my integrity as a lawyer. I am known as an honest man, and honest will I remain, known to the last. Besides, I could do nothing to effect his enlargement if I tried. Nothing but the plainest proof that he is innocent or that another man is guilty would avail now to release him from the suspicion which his own admissions have aroused." "Then there is no hope?" was her slow and despairing reply. "None at present, Imogene," was his stern, almost as despairing answer. As Mr. Orcutt sat over his lonely hearth that evening, a servant brought to him the following letter: "Dear friend, it is not fit that I should remain any longer under your roof. I have a duty before me which separates me forever from the friendship and protection of honorable men and women. No home but such as I can provide for myself by the work of my own hands shall henceforth shelter the disgraced head of Imogene Dare. Her fate, whatever it may prove to be, she bears alone, and you, who have been so kind, shall never suffer from any association with one whose name must henceforth become the sport of the crowd, if not the execration of the virtuous. If your generous heart rebels at this, choke it relentlessly down. I shall be already gone when you read these lines, and nothing you could do or say would make me come back. Good bye, and may Heaven grant you forgetfulness of one whose only return to your benefactions has been to make you suffer almost as much as she suffers herself." As Mr. Orcutt read these last lines, District Attorney Ferris was unsealing the anonymous missive which has already been laid before my readers. End of chapter 20.